My daughter-in-law sent me a bottle of wine. I gave it to her mother. She panicked. I didn't mean for those 6 words to become the hinge on which the next year of my life turned. But there it is. One small, polite gift, and a single choice that unspooled into everything. If you're watching from somewhere warm or cold, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you like a twisty true crime tale, hit like and subscribe. I promise this one will keep you looking over your shoulder. It was my 67th birthday. I still baked my own cake most years, even if the icing never looked professional. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and lemon. The old radio in the kitchen played some light jazz while I put out plates. Kevin called early with a quick, cheerful happy birthday and a promise to come by that afternoon with— he paused, embarrassed. Something small. He sounded like a man trying to be casual about a small, ordinary visit, the way grown children do, as if we both understood that ordinary is rarely what life gives you. The wine arrived that morning, not with a card at first, but on the back stoop in a brown box, 2 bottles nestled in straw. The delivery tag had my name scrawled across it and a note, "For Margaret, with love." The label on one bottle was heavy, old vineyard script, a deep burgundy glass, the neck wrapped in a gold foil the way they do when they want you to think of oak barrels and long summers. Someone had tied a single sprig of dried lavender to the cork with twine. It was the sort of gift that announces itself. It was the sort of gift you set on the table and admire, like a piece of art you don't quite know where to hang. I'd met Ashley only a handful of times before that morning. She was Kevin's wife, married a little less than 3 years at that point. The kind of person who could make a room feel both lived in and staged at once. Confident, tidy, with a habit of angling her body when she listened, as if she wanted to catch every word and catalog it. She sent a text that morning. "Happy birthday, Mom Henderson. Hope you like the wine." There was a string of heart emojis, 2, then an extra wink. People send presents for all kinds of reasons. I had taught kids for 40 years. I was used to decoding the polite and the plain. The thing about being old enough to have a grandchild old enough to bring champagne to your door is that you learn to notice small misalignments. A sentence that doesn't belong in a conversation. A laugh that arrives a touch too late. A question that pries. My eye landed on the bottle again that afternoon, and I remember the way the sunlight cut across the glass, turning the burgundy into something alive. I ran a fingertip along the foil and felt the small ridges of the foil. Not tampered with, at least to the naked eye. I didn't open it. There was no reason to. Kevin arrived with a bouquet and a sheepish grin, and we stood in the kitchen drinking tea, talking about his latest audit at work, the state of the tomatoes in my garden, trivial things that keep the world tolerable. At some point, Ashley called. I answered on speaker because that's what you do when you have 3 people in the kitchen and want to be polite. Her voice was bright, clipped with a practiced warmth. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Henderson. Did you get the wine?" she asked, as if checking off an item on a list. I said yes, where it sat, and thanked her. She laughed like someone who had just delivered a successful surprise and was waiting for applause. Then she paused. "Did you open it yet?" That question was ordinary until it wasn't. A harmless curiosity became a needle prick the instant it landed. There was an edge to the way she asked it, too quick, too purposeful. I remember the small motor memory of my hand tightening around the teacup. "No," I said. "I haven't. I thought we'd save it." "Save it?" she echoed, and there was a tiny hardness in the syllable. "For Kevin's birthday? For dinner?" she was asking, but I could hear her thinking through who would be near the bottle and when. The conversation moved along, and I laughed it off, because what else do you do? You don't make a scene over a bottle of wine. You don't lean into a suspicion like a dog at the edge of a cliff. But the thing about little tensions is they grow. They curl under your skin. When Ashley asked again, this time in a different tone, the kind people use when they're trying to steer you to a very specific answer, I felt the room tilt. "Margaret, are you sure you didn't open it?" I'd hate for anything to happen to it. You know, with travel and the heat. I stopped listening to the rest of the sentence. My hands went to the bottle before my brain told them to. I wrapped my fingers around the foil and felt that same ridged texture. I turned the bottle slightly. No breach, no obvious sign anything had been inserted or swapped. The rational part of me filed the moment under petty oddity, the teacher reflex cataloging a student's tiny habit. But there was something else. The clarity that comes when you notice small pieces don't fit together, and you suddenly know they never will. I did something I had not planned. "I'll save it for dinner," I said. "Actually," I looked at Kevin, and then across the narrow yard to where our neighbor's wisteria shaded her front stoop. Linda was out there, tending to a pot of basil, humming under her breath, as she often did on sunny afternoons. Linda Morrison was 92 then, spry as a woman half her age, with more stories and a sharper memory than most people I knew. She baked biscuits every Thursday and kept a copy of the local paper on her porch like scripture. She was not, in fact, Ashley's mother. But when Ashley called, when she'd found out Linda was coming over later in the day, she'd texted Kevin a photo of Linda smiling and said, joking, "Tell Mom I sent something for her." And whether she'd meant it as a joke or as a test, I couldn't tell. I walked my cup to the sink and set the bottle on the counter. "Kevin, Linda's coming by," I said. "Why don't I give her the bottle? She'll love it, and it'll be a nice surprise." You could see Kevin's confusion, the small crease of his brow. He and Ashley had their own rhythm, and Kevin often let things slide because that was easier for him than starting a fight. He shrugged. "Sure, Mom, if you think." His voice trailed off the way it does when your instincts and your love are in opposite corners. So I wrapped the bottle in a thin tea towel, tied the twine again around the neck like I was wrapping a secret, and walked it across the yard. Linda's porch was a tableau of life slowed down. A rake leaned against the railing, a radio faintly playing Patsy Cline, a little jar of sugar for the sparrows. She greeted me with a toothy grin, and when I handed it to her, she put her hand over her heart in that surprised way old neighbors do, like the world had offered them a small miracle. "Margaret, what a treat," she said. She smelled of lavender soap and peppermint candy. She'd been a seamstress all her life, and her hands told it, calloused, precise. You shouldn't have. We chatted on the porch bench about the tomatoes and the neighbor's noisy cat. She insisted on pouring a small glass right away. "Only a sip," she said, and I sat there with my elbows on my knees, pretending I hadn't built the moment like a stage set. She brought the glass to her lips and swallowed. The afternoon sun slanted across her hair, silver and bright. I walked back to the house with the littlest of unease, the kind that lives behind the sternum and waits. I remember thinking, absurdly, of a frightful novel I'd once read, where every little kindness had teeth. I laughed at myself for being melodramatic. I'd lived alone for long stretches, and my imagination liked to host unsought parties. Kevin left early for an engagement, and we waved at the gate. The house felt ordinary when he was gone, quiet in that way that lets you hear the refrigerator hum. The first call came while I was folding laundry. My phone buzzed, and the screen lit up with Ashley's name. My thumb flicked it open. She sounded small on the line, not cruel, not threatened, but badly, badly frightened. "Margaret," she said, and the syllable of my name was like a stone landing. "Is Linda there with the wine?" "Yes," I said, because that was the truth. I could hear her pacing. "She just had a little. She's fine." She said she felt lightheaded for a moment, but she laughed and said the sun was strong today. There was a pause, an intake of breath that might have been composure failing. "Please, Margaret, please tell me she didn't actually drink much. Tell me, did she open the bottle? Is there any—" Her words broke off, and a sob sharpened the rest. It was a pleading that had nothing to do with wine and everything to do with something that had been planned to fall into place without question. It's funny the things you think about in a panic. I remember the absurd domestic choreography, where the wine had been placed, the way Linda held the glass, which side dish she'd refused to take. Anxiety narrows your world to a few precise frames. She had a little, I said very carefully. It wasn't much, maybe a quarter of a glass. She's sitting, she's talking. I'm watching her. Don't let her go anywhere. Call 911 if she looks worse. Tell Kevin to come. The list came in short, fractured orders, like she was trying to build a ladder of actions to climb out of something. It felt theatrical in the worst way, like someone reading directions with too much haste. I walked back across the yard to the porch. Linda was sitting still, one hand on the glass, one hand on the banister. Her face had gone just a shade paler. She tried to joke about the heat and failed. She'd always been cheeky in the face of concern. "I've had worse cookin' than this," she mumbled, but the words were blunted. We called an ambulance. I said the things you say when you're trying to communicate urgency without panic. Her name, her age, that she'd had a sip of wine and had become dizzy. The operator's voice was calm and instructive. She asked if Linda was breathing normally, if she'd fainted. Linda was conscious and annoyed at the fuss. She refused to go at first, the kind of stubbornness you only respect when it comes from someone who has lived a long life and knows how small hospitals can be. But the color in her cheeks had drained enough that I felt my logic slide under the surface into a cold place where instinct lives. At the emergency room, the fluorescent lights were merciless. Waiting rooms smell the same everywhere. Cleaning solution, cheap coffee, the hospital's own antiseptic breath. Doctors and nurses moved with steady precision. We explained what happened in careful sentences, reliving it as if reciting a short play. 1 bottle of wine, 1 small glass, immediate lightheadedness. A nurse took Linda's vitals, and then a doctor, Dr. Patricia Williams, introduced herself. She had kind eyes and hands that moved like they were used to working under pressure. "We'll run some basic panels," Dr. Williams said, and that was that. Blood work, observation, fluids if needed. They put Linda on a monitor, and the beeping became the new metronome of my day. I called Kevin from the hospital room because his voice is a compass in moments like that. He drove from his office like a man moving through a dream. What they did not say aloud, which I could hear like a skipped riff in a song, was that some small thing in that glass might be more than small. The term I heard first was toxicology, and it felt like the floor had dropped out of the kitchen. The nurse explained gently. They were sending blood and a sample of the wine out for analysis. It could be nothing. It could be everything. In the gaps between the sentences, I could hear a world recalculating itself. In the ER waiting area, the surreal quality of it all sank in. People shuffled and coughed, televisions murmured with muted soap operas, and the clock on the wall methodically advanced. Ashley called repeatedly. At one point she burst into the room and sat down across from me, her mascara running in little tracks like a ritual I'd never seen her perform. She clasped her hands and said, "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I didn't mean—" And then she stopped, the words collapsing. Kevin took her aside and came back with a face like someone who had bitten on tin. He sat beside me, one hand speaking with small squeezes. He asked practical questions. What Linda had eaten that day, whether she'd taken any medications. I recounted the afternoon with teacherly precision. Who had been present, the wine on the porch, the way Linda had tasted it. Kevin's jaw worked as if he were trying to grind through disbelief. "Why would Ashley—" he began, and then the sentence gave up and turned into a hollow laugh. The samples took hours. 0 to 60 minutes feels quick in most things. In hospital time, it is both a lifetime and a blink. Nurse stations shifted. People reassured us as much as they could. I watched Dr. Williams move through the unit like someone carrying a lantern. Efficient, concise, compassionate. She explained that certain toxins show up on specific panels, that they would test for the things that usually make people lightheaded, common causes, and that they would include a toxicology screen because it was better to be thorough. The word that finally cleaved the room apart arrived on a phone call in the middle of the night. I remember the hum of the fluorescent light and the way the clock read 2:14 a.m. The voice on the other end was low and factual. The lab had preliminary results. There was a line of silence heavy enough to sit on. "We found ethylene glycol," the critic said, as if reading from a chemistry manual. There's no graceful thing to say after that. Ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. People know the word in the way you know a piece of bad news before it's explained. You know the shape of its consequences. I felt Kevin's hand squeeze mine until my fingers ached. Ashley made a sound I'd never heard from her. A raw, keening noise that was not quite a sob, but more like the sound a person makes when a carefully rehearsed script falls into pieces. She asked if there could be some mistake. She asked the nurses if there had been a mix-up in the lab. She asked the doctor if Linda would be all right. Dr. Williams didn't look away. "We'll treat the symptoms and begin appropriate care," she said, and she was steady because her job required it. She explained, in broad, non-technical terms, that ethylene glycol is dangerous, that it can cause organ failure if not addressed, and that their next steps would be to stabilize Linda, administer what medicine might help, and wait for confirmatory testing. She didn't speak in predictions. She kept her face the same as she outlined the next steps. In that moment, the ER became less a place of consolations and more a place where consequences take physical form. After the call, the hospital staff asked me and Kevin many questions: janitorial logs, neighbors who had access to the porch, whether anyone had been in the house who shouldn't have. I told them everything I knew, which was not as much as it suddenly felt like I should have known. I felt oddly exposed, like a house whose windows had been left open. Little details rearranged themselves into new patterns. Ashley's questions about the bottle, the way she'd texted a photo of Linda, the timing of everything. My teacher's brain tried to place them into an outline: motive, opportunity, means. I tried not to let myself use words like intent or planned, because those belonged in courtrooms and novels, not in a fluorescent emergency room with a woman in distress on a gurney. That night, a sheriff's deputy came by the hospital. He was young, too young for the gravel in his voice, and he introduced himself as Danny, a nephew of a colleague, he said. He asked if I would come down to the station to give a written statement. I agreed. Writing things down makes them real in a way that spoken words don't. It's one thing to tell a story to a nurse, another to sign your name to it. On the way home from the hospital, Kevin and I sat in the car while Ashley drove ahead of us, taking calls that I could only half hear through the open windows. Kevin kept glancing back at the house the way you do when you fear your life has been invaded by something unseen. He asked a question I'd already been asking myself. Why would she do this? It was a weirdly childlike question, but also the only one that made sense. You don't ask who when you know people are complicated. You ask why because you hope why can be answered. We slept in fits. The phone buzzed with updates. Linda remained under observation. The lab would call with confirmatory results in the morning, they said. I sat up in the dark and thought about every gift that had ever come through my door. I thought about the names people put on the boxes of their lives. I thought about how a twine bow could hold a secret in its twist. In the gray of the next morning, there was a knock at my kitchen door. It was a man in plain clothes with a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Detective Sarah Murphy. Her presence changed the tenor of the house. Where the hospital had been clinical, the detective brought a new clarity. We were no longer only victims and patients. This was becoming a case. She was direct, efficient in the way of people who have made it their business to cut through confusion. She asked for a detailed account. I told her about the bottle, about the way Ashley had asked if I'd opened it, about the conversation on the porch. She nodded at points, asked a few follow-ups, wrote down names in a small notebook. She asked me to show her the place where the bottle had been. We walked through the sunlit kitchen and onto the porch where the wisteria had started to bud. Everything looked ordinary. so ordinary that the ordinariness itself became suspect. Detective Murphy asked whether there had been any talk of wills or money, and I felt a flush of heat, a little embarrassment. "Not really," I said. "I had a will, yes. What elderly person does not? But we are not people who sit around carving out inheritances like cakes." Kevin and I hadn't had those conversations at length. Still, in her polite, steady way, the detective noted any friction in the family, any reason someone might appear friendly but be less so behind closed doors. She took photographs, scribbled on her pad, and looked at me with the kind of empathetic attention that is part consolation, part investigatory strategy. By noon, the hospital called with confirmatory results. The voice on the other end of the line was not the lab tech's. It was Dr. Williams, and she kept her voice steady as if she was striding across thin ice. "The toxicology report is conclusive," she said. "Ethylene glycol is present in Linda's blood and in a sample of the wine. Words have weight. Ethylene glycol. 2 syllables, but they carry with them an entire gravity." The detective's pen froze. Kevin's face folded. Ashley, who'd been sitting with a face made of rubber, looked like someone who was peeling away. "What does this mean?" Kevin asked. The question a kid's voice in a grown man's throat. "It means we have to treat this as an attempted poisoning," Detective Murphy said. Her voice had the clarity of someone who'd rather be blunt and correct than gentle and wrong. She explained that the next steps would be to collect evidence, to secure the bottle for lab analysis, to speak with everyone who had been near Linda that day. She asked us about cameras, about any social media posts, and about anything else that might suggest why someone would do this. Ashley's hands were folded so tight her knuckles shone white. At one point, she leaned forward and said, "I would never hurt her. I would never do that." Her voice was pitched to convince. But there are lines people cross when they have rehearsed persuasion for long enough. Sometimes you can smell the effort of it. I had a feeling then, an old teacher's sense, that she had practiced guilt in the mirror. The police took the bottle from me carefully, placing it into an evidence bag with gloved hands. They recorded serial numbers and chain of custody with a kind of ritual that felt both thorough and ceremonial. In the hallway, I felt my world compress into a series of official pages, statements, signatures, sworn testimony. The house seemed suddenly too quiet. The porch I had walked across 100 times felt like a stage where the set had been turned over. They asked me to give them Ashley's contact information and any history I knew. I gave what I had: phone numbers, the address she and Kevin shared, the times she'd been over. It seemed absurdly small given the enormity of the word that had landed in our lives the night before. Attempted poisoning, motive, evidence. Each word felt like a stone being laid down across a road I had been walking my entire life. After the detective left, the house felt like the lull after a thunderstorm. I sat at my kitchen table and tried to read a page in a book, but the words swam. I thought of Linda on the gurney, of nurses speaking low, of Dr. Williams' steady hands. I thought of Kevin's face in the ER, the way his eyes had gone liquid and lost. I thought of a wine bottle wrapped in a towel across the table like a silent witness. The ordinary objects in my life took on a new cast. Lamps looked like searchlights, forks like instruments of decision. There was one consolation in the chaos, small and stubborn. Linda was stable enough to have been moved out of the critical care area. She squeezed my hand when I went back to the hospital's quiet room, and she gave me that sardonic smile I'd come to love. "You always did like to send each other presents," she said in a whisper, and for a moment we laughed like conspirators at some private joke. But behind that laugh was a tension I could feel in my bones. Someone, somewhere, had decided that poison was a tool to be used in a life, that the trajectory of other people's days could be altered with a small bottle and a precise plan. The thought of planning is what unsettled me most. Crime done in a moment is one thing. Crime that requires thought and lists and timing is another. It implies calculation, rehearsal, and a willingness to treat human life as accounting. As the detective packed up her notes, she warned us gently not to discuss the case with anyone except the investigators. She explained that public talk could tip off a person who might be watching. It was an odd admonition, because perhaps it was the first time I understood fully that we were already being watched. The kindness in her voice carried the caution of someone who had seen how quickly lives become spectacles. We left the hospital with a notebook full of questions and a silence that felt heavy. Kevin sat in the driver's seat and rubbed the bridge of his nose as if to keep his thoughts from spilling out. Ashley watched the rearview mirror as if checking how she looked from all angles. I carried the memory of the bottle like a small, dense thing pressed to my chest. That night, the house felt like a place holding its breath. I made tea because habit is a prayer. I sat by the window and watched the streetlight wash the yard in a yellow hush. My brain kept returning to the kitchen counter and the little twine bow that had been tied around the bottle. I imagined hands tying knots, lists being made, names circled in a ledger. The imagination is a dangerous instrument in a moment like that. It fills in blanks with sharp edges. I slept in short stretches and woke to the sun gilding the curtains. The phone call that morning came from Detective Murphy again. She spoke quietly, efficiently. "We're going to need you to go through anything that seems out of place," she said. "We'll have officers around while you do it. No one is to remove items from the house." Her tone was practical, but there was a reserved steadiness beneath it. She wasn't surprised by the world's cruelty because she'd seen it before. I said I understood. I felt like a character in someone else's novel, assigned a task I had not chosen. When the officers came by, I led them through the house like someone taking inventory of their life. Drawers opened to reveal school pictures and old lesson plans. The kitchen pantry held jars of preserves I'd made the previous summer. The officers photographed everything with their small digital cameras, the place where the bottle had sat, Linda's teacup on the porch, my garden gloves hanging by the back door. The ritual of documentation felt like a liturgy of loss. That afternoon, as the house emptied and the sun moved west, I sat with a stack of papers the detective had left me. A pamphlet on elder safety, a number to call if I felt threatened. I kept reading and rereading the instructions in a daze. The world had recast itself in a new vocabulary: evidence, investigation, chain of custody. Wait, for a long time I had thought such words belonged in other people's lives, the sort that happen in true crime documentaries, not the quiet cul-de-sac where I knew every neighbor by name. There is a peculiar loneliness to being singled out as a target. People treat you differently once they know you might have been hurt. Some offer platitudes, others offer distance. But Kevin was a constant in all of it. He cooked for me for a few days, his way of translating anxiety into service. He took the mail to the end of the driveway and got the newspaper each morning. He sat with me on the porch late into the night and talked in small, clipped sentences about nothing and everything. Of course, the obvious question remained: why? I turned it over the way a child takes apart a toy to see how it works. When you have taught for as long as I had, you come to understand that people's motives are often embarrassingly simple: money, power, convenience, masked by niceties. The detective had asked about wills. She had asked about recent changes in financial arrangements. I gave the answers I had, nothing dramatic, but the seed of suspicion had already taken root and begun to grow. That night, I could not sleep. I sat with a small lamp on my bedside table and read the newspaper in the way people used to, one paragraph at a time, as if I could inoculate myself against the idea that malice had existed in my neighborhood. My eyes drifted to the corkscrew on the counter, to the jar of preserved cherries, to the small black pepper grinder. Objects that had once offered comfort now seemed implicated by proximity. I felt a new, prickly awareness of every little thing that came into the house, because the simple act of giving could be a weapon. Outside, somewhere down the block, someone's dog barked. I listened and thought of Linda in a hospital bed, of Ashley's frantic tone, of Detective Murphy waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to emerge. There was no tidy resolution waiting for me in the folds of the night, only the knowledge that the days ahead would demand patience and a kind of attention I hadn't needed before. The next morning, the lab called with further clarifications. They used words like conclusive and matched sample, but I had stopped trying to parse the jargon into comfort. I went to the kitchen and touched the notches of the cutting board, the place where my knives sat, and felt the quiet of the ordinary press against my palms. The detective had told us not to speak to the press. She'd said it plainly: protect the case, protect yourselves. I put on my coat and walked across the yard to Linda's house. She was home that afternoon, less pale, more stubborn. She took my hand and said in that steady voice of hers, "We're still going to have berries this summer." It was a small, defiant optimism, and it steadied me more than anything else the detectives had said. It reminded me that the world, for all its darkness, still made room for such tiny resistances. As I walked back to my own house, a neighbor named Mr. Trask, an old widower who loved football more than he loved people, called out from across the street. "You all right, Margaret?" he asked, and I nodded because I was. Mostly. The acknowledgement felt like a stitch. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote. I wrote a list of everything I could think of that might belong in an investigation. The times people had been over, the names of tradesmen who'd been in the house, anyone who might have had motive. The list read like a poor detective's bill of particulars. I signed each page out of habit, Margaret Henderson, and then I laid the papers in a folder the way a teacher lays out assignments for next week's class. It felt, in that small ritual, like the only thing I could do to keep my life tethered to itself. The phone rang late, Detective Murphy again. She had arranged for officers to keep an eye on the house for the time being. She wanted me to be careful. When she finished, she said one sentence that stayed with me. "These cases tend to grow bigger before they settle. Be aware." I folded the cover of the folder and left it on the kitchen table. The bottle was gone, taken as evidence. The twine was no longer tied. The lavender sprig lay in the trash where I had discarded it. In its absence, the house felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because the dangerous object was not in my hands. Heavier because the absence proved that something malicious had been present. That night I didn't sleep much. My mind kept returning to the question of motive. If this had been a thoughtless act, it might hurt less, but the presence of a lab result made everything look intended. Who looks at a life and thinks in terms of inheritance and ease? Who writes the kind of lists that lead to a wine bottle on a porch? We were still in the first small, dangerous act of the story. A call, a bottle, a hospital bed. I felt like someone standing at the foot of a long staircase, seeing a single step ahead and nothing more. I could not know the full architecture of what lay above, only that the ascent would be steep, and that someone had left breadcrumbs from which a terrible pattern might be traced. And somewhere beyond my house, in the world where people's choices make consequences they never intended, a plan either continued to fold itself together or unravel. I did not yet know which. The phone buzzed on the kitchen table like a heartbeat, and I watched it, waiting for the next piece to fall into place. The next piece fell into place faster than I'd expected, like a hand sliding into the back of a familiar coat. Detective Murphy called that afternoon with a new tone, one that suggested the long, slow scouring of a problem had found a bright edge. "We're going to expand the canvas," she said, blunt and efficient. "We'd like to take a look at Ashley's things. We'll get a search warrant." When the officers went to Ashley and Kevin's house, I sat at my kitchen table holding my folder of notes and pretending I was making sense of a crossword. Kevin paced the living room in circles, and the house felt full of things that wanted to be spoken. He'd already packed a small overnight bag. He kept saying he might stay with a friend, then changing his mind and sitting back down as if trying to will himself into a new reality. The mystery of motive can crumble a man in a way I did not expect. Kevin had always been steady, an anchor, and watching him wobble made me feel both terrified and fiercely protective. Danny, Deputy Danny, the sheriff's department contact who'd come to the hospital as a favor, was the one who called me in the late afternoon. "We found a lot," he said without preamble. There was something in his voice that was part apology and part grim satisfaction that comes when careful work yields results. "We pulled a laptop. We pulled paperwork. We need you to come down and look through it with us." At the station, the room where they'd spread Ashley's belongings looked absurdly ordinary. A kettle on the counter, a half-empty mug, a stack of labeled receipts. But there were things under those domestic layers that shifted the room into something darker. A folder of documents caught my eye, a file of life insurance policies in different names, all benefiting her. Names that weren't familiar until Detective Murphy slid me a printout. Thomas Bradley, Marcus Chen. My throat tightened when I saw the dates. Thomas had died 5 years earlier, Marcus 3 years later. Both deaths had been labeled under ordinary circumstances in the local papers. An accident here, an illness there. No red flags at the time, nothing that raised the kind of steady alarm that would make headlines. But the folder showed payout dates, amounts that were substantial enough to have changed a life, and a curiosity that put a cold hand on my shoulder. Ashley's name cropped up on forms as a beneficiary or a witness. There were old email exchanges with insurance agents, and a paper trail that suggested someone had been doing their homework, filling in blanks with careful strokes. Then there was the laptop. It sat there like any other piece of technology, plastic, smudged with fingerprints. But when Detective Murphy opened it and I saw the screen, my hands began to shake in a way I could not control. The desktop was full of folders. One file opened and I read the word opportunities before my eyes blurred. It was an ugly, clinical spreadsheet. Dates, names, notes. The layout itself was unremarkable, but the content was quietly monstrous. Entries that read like scheduling for a life, faintly bureaucratic, place, date, availability, notes. There were columns where certain names were circled or flagged. I could feel the breath leave the room. Kevin had to leave the station. He stepped outside and let the warm slab of late summer sun hit his face. He pinched the bridge of his nose and made that small sound people make when they're trying to keep their composure. He looked at me then, with a grief that was hollowing him out. "He's my mother," he kept saying, as if repeating it would change the fact of what the papers suggested. "She's my—" He couldn't finish. Words were inadequate then. They still are. Detective Murphy asked me to read aloud any correspondence that seemed relevant. There were strings of texts from Ashley that at first glance could have passed for ordinary marital affection. Pet names, light jokes, plans. Then there were others, more surgical, messages about schedule changes, notes about who would be at the house and when, photographs taken of doorways and welcome mats. None were explicit in the way a prosecutor would need. They were cruel in their banality. They were the annotations of someone cataloging access. We were all aware then of the pattern. 2 previous husbands, life insurance payouts, the careful accrual of resources. There were gaps, things missing you might expect in a tidy criminal record, but patterns are persuasive things. They hook into our sense of narrative, and once you see a line through disparate events, it becomes difficult to unsee it. That night, news vans were parked 2 streets over like moths to a porch light. Somebody had called the paper. Somebody else had called a friend of a friend. The things I had always thought private were suddenly public, because public provides a sort of shorthand for plausibility. If enough people say something, it becomes easier to believe. Kevin grew sullen and silent. He stayed in the den and let the television wash his face in color he didn't match with expression. When he finally spoke, it was small and raw. "I married her," he said. "I loved her." Simple facts, not questions. An attempt to anchor himself to reality. Ashley did not come back to the house. That night she packed a bag, what little the reporters were able to confirm of her movements, and by morning a warrant was out and there was a notation that she had left town. Detectives dotted the map with places she might have gone. If she was trying to be unseen, she was doing a poor job of it. She was too young to know how obvious it is when someone who's used to being watched tries to flee without the quiet of preparation. Or perhaps she had intended not to flee at all. I always had the nagging thought that there are people who leave because they're confident they can walk back in and flourish. In the days that followed, the house felt like a locus of consequences. The sheriff's department set up surveillance on a few leads. Detective Murphy kept us informed in a way that was both clinical and human. She told us what they knew without overpromising what they could do. That steadiness became a kind of anchor. She would come by the house some evenings, sit at the kitchen table with a thermos and a notebook, and ask questions that were precise and kind. It's strange how domestic geography transmutes under suspicion. The guest room became a place where officers came to review maps. The porch where I'd left a wine bottle now had an officer's chair sometimes, a presence that made the neighborhood seem under a protective eye and a scrutiny that felt almost violating. Mr. Trask started walking past our house again with a swagger that suggested he had an inside scoop, which he did not. Mrs. Cole from 2 doors down baked a dish and left it on our stoop with a note, "Thinking of you." My life had become an odd mixture of public sympathy and private unsettlement. Then came the news that made the air go thin. Ashley had been identified in police footage in a town 3 counties over. The footage was grainy, the sort of image that turns determined people into mythic figures and makes us all amateur detectives. But it was enough to get a team mobilized. They found, in one motel room, evidence of a plan, maps, notebooks, a list of names that matched the spreadsheet's shorthand. One of the detectives read a passage aloud, and the room went quiet. A line about timing and a shorthand reference that tied her movements to days when her husbands were known to be vulnerable. I had to look away while the detective filled in the more damning contextual pieces for the record. It was impossible not to think of all the small kindnesses that had led to this anchor: hosting dinners, learning how Kevin liked his coffee, being the woman who made sure all the lights were on when guests arrived. The banality of domestic life had been weaponized. In an effort to find her, if not to make her surrender, then to make the truth unavoidable, the department devised a plan that sat uncomfortably with me. We'd bait the possibility of contact with public posts, invite her to come into a monitored space, and have officers ready. Kevin, with a bravery he never credited himself for, agreed to be the bait. He would go to a place where they believed she might meet him, wearing a wire. It was an ugly cinematic idea that felt like something out of a movie, but that was where life and law enforcement met sometimes, in the slightly theatrical space where danger could be controlled. I had questions. 100. Would it be safe? Could this make her more dangerous? Could we turn this desperation into a trap? Detective Murphy's answers were steady. "We'll be there," she told me. "We'll have people around." Her voice held a patience that suggested she understood how much trust it took for a son to walk into a place where his wife might show up to kill a narrative she'd been trying to complete. On the day of the pond, Miller's Pond looked like the kind of place you'd take a picnic. It's a small body of water about 15 minutes from town, a ring of pines and a bench that looks out over the glassy surface. We arrived early. Kevin, wired, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. Detective Murphy and a team tucked into the bushes with radios. Danny stationed on a distant road. I sat on the bench and felt my hands go cold. The pond waters were still, reflecting everything without comment. I watched leaves tremble in a light breeze. I thought about how many things in life pretend to be calm before they reveal themselves to be something else. Kevin's voice over the wire came distant, quiet. He spoke in the ordinary cadence practiced by people who want to keep conversation banal. "Coffee? Traffic." He fished, trying to seem like the man who had not realized how fragile his life had become. I watched as people came and went, fishermen, dog walkers, a woman with a baby, and impatiently scanned for her. When Ashley appeared, she did not come with the swagger of someone hiding. She walked like someone who believed she belonged where she stood. There was a deceptive calm to her, a kind of linen coolness to how she moved. She wore a jacket despite the heat. Her eyes landed on Kevin with that practiced tilt. She smiled like someone who'd rehearsed regret. She sat down beside him as if the bench belonged to her, and she began to speak in that mellifluous way I'd heard before. Soft apologies braided with affectionate references, and the odd bit of manipulation that came so easy to her. Kevin played his part, and the wire hummed with everything he said. Other officers watched, waiting for a break in the practiced cadence. Then it happened. She began to talk about money, not openly, but in a way that circled like a vulture. She asked why certain decisions had been made, who'd been present at different times, who would be in the house with me. The bait was working. She was seemingly luring him into the intimacy where trust had once been built. At one point, her hand reached for his, and the words she used were precise, promises of a future, halting confessions about mistakes she said she wished she could fix. It was the kind of performance that could make a jury pity you if they chose to. But through the wire, her talk took a turn, a slip of a truth. She said, in a voice almost casual, "It was never about money at first. It was about opportunity, names, dates, times. I put them all in one place. It made sense." The officers moved then, swift and efficient. A pair of them stepped out from behind a clump of reeds and called her name. It happened quickly, a compression of moments that feel both like forever and a blink. She looked for a heartbeat like a cornered animal, clever, feral, calculating. She made a dash for the car, and it turned into a struggle, arms flailing, a shot, one shot, fired, a cry that was high and terrible, and then a hand and cuffs and a face that looked suddenly very small and very tired. I watched as they led her away, as if the physical act of movement might carry the weight of motive off her shoulders. Later, at the hospital, she had a wound in her shoulder where a bullet had grazed her. Nothing cinematic, no dramatic spatter or gore, only a clean injury that would mend with time. She lay in a bed, looking like someone who had been stripped of a mask. When she spoke to Detective Murphy in the sterile room, her words were less practiced than before. "I didn't mean it went too far," she said. There was a tremor to her voice I hadn't heard in public performances. Whether that tremor was real remorse or a sudden panic about consequences, I couldn't tell. The county held her in custody. The arrest was headline news for a week, then another for the wound she'd taken and the drama at the pond. People circled like vultures and angels in equal measure, some offering sympathy to Kevin, some being ugly in their judgments without knowing the full frame. The press loved narratives, simple arcs, clear villains and victims. The truth, of course, is always more ragged than a headline. Then the newsline that makes your blood turn over. Ashley had escaped custody. That sentence collapsed all the calm Detective Murphy had put together. How she'd done it didn't become part of the public record in any useful way for residents like me, and I will not speculate on technique. What mattered to me was the knowledge that the person who had been in custody for the attack was now loose and capable of movement. I felt, suddenly, unmoored. Detective Murphy and Danny upped security on the neighborhood. They advised I take precautions. They sent patrols by at odd hours. For a time, there were enough officers in the area that it had a faux sense of safety. But safety is a fragile thing. It depends on the unknowable, on the choices other people make. My sleep became skittish. I checked doors twice. I started leaving the hall light on. The world had shifted to a state of heightened attention that I had thought exhausted in early days, but here returned like an unwelcome guest. A week after her escape, there was a late knock. I opened the door and found Detective Murphy and 2 others in my doorway. "We've had reports," she said. "People saw someone near your property." The report was correct. I'd heard a noise in the night and looked out to see a flash of movement near the back fence. A car had sped away. I called the number they'd given me for anything suspicious, and it felt like using a lifeline. They told me to go to a safe place. The detective offered me the spare key to Kevin's friend's house and a number to call if anything happened, and stayed with me for a while until they were called to other things. The weeks that followed contained a pressure that felt like the tightness of a drum. We tried to return to normal, but the cadence had changed. We went through motions, me with my teacher's rituals of mornings, and Kevin returning to work in a staggering attempt at normalcy. But the surface tension under everything was palpable. People treated us like characters in a story they could judge from the outside. My friends were kind and distant in equal measure. Linda recovered and came home, though she was quieter and more vigilant than before. She'd stop by and make me a cup of tea, and in a whisper that felt like prayer, remind me to lock the doors when I went to bed. Then, on a raw, gusty night, she came back. It was nearly midnight when I heard the sound. The back door creak, a heavy slam, the sound of a presence in a room that had been empty. I lived alone with ordinary nocturnal noises, pipes settling and the occasional car. But this sound was wrong, insistent. My heart hammered in my ears. Instinct woke me like cold water. I reached for my phone and hit record without thinking more than that it felt necessary to capture something honest should anything happen. "You shouldn't have left the door unlocked," a voice said, and I recognized it like a smell. It was Ashley's voice, ragged and triumphant at the same time. She moved through the kitchen like she owned the light switches, like she had rehearsed this finality into place. For a moment I thought the whole thing might end in a conversation. She'd come to plead, to confess, to demand, to create drama. Instead, she skipped the pretense and moved to the plain fact. "I came back," she said. Her voice had a thinness to it, a damaged clarity. "I couldn't," she paused. "I couldn't let them have him. I thought." And then she did something I didn't expect. She confessed in a way that was ordinary, like someone reading notes. She explained bits of the spreadsheet, bits of the timing, and in between say-sos she let slip small claims. That it had been about money, that it had been about control, that it had been about making a life in which she didn't feel dependent. She didn't tell me how to do anything. She told me why. It was a confession, not a tutorial. I kept the phone in my hand and watched the clock while I let her speak. I was breathing shallow. Somehow the body goes into mechanical management when the mind is reeling. She paced the kitchen, and sometimes she laughed in a way that had no humor in it. When she said that she'd planned for contingencies, that word planned felt like an ugly formal thing, and I held my hand over the recorder and listened, making mental notes of everything. At one point, she sat opposite me at the table. The house's night filled with the sound of wind. She looked at me as if measuring my age, my smallness. "You were careful," she said, a compliment that stuck like a pin. "You knew how to hide things." It was meant to wound and flatter both. But something about the way she spoke in the nakedness of her exhaustion made me more curious than afraid. She sounded tired rather than threatening. She looked like someone who'd been unraveling for a long time. When she finally made a move, she lunged toward the back door as if to escape. Maybe she'd meant to stage something that would make us both seem pathetic. Maybe she'd meant to prove she still had the capacity to surprise. The details don't matter beyond the fact that there was a noise outside, a siren, and then lights flashing like spectral punctuation. Detective Murphy and Danny had followed a thread, a license plate reported by a neighbor, a movement spotted on a traffic camera. They moved quietly and efficiently into the yard. I remember the sound of boots on the porch, the polite but assertive command to put hands where officers could see them. Ashley made a small animal sound, a half sob, half sigh, and turned toward them like someone caught in a net. They took her into custody again without another shot. She did not resist in a physical way. The resistance had already been exhausted in sound. The recorder in my hand saved every word. When the officers took her away, they asked if I'd be willing to make a statement. I said yes. I sat under the porch light and watched them lead her down the driveway. Her head was bent. Her hair fell over her face like a curtain. She did not look like someone who believed in her own invincibility anymore. Later, in the weeks that followed, the evidence accumulated in ways that kept the narrative tight enough for a jury. The spreadsheet's metadata showed edits going back years. There were emails connecting the insurance policies and a series of aliases Ashley had used, variations of her name, different last names depending on which man she was courting. Each piece of paper, each time-stamped email was another stitch in the cloth of a long tenderness turned toxic. The prosecutor's office assembled the case with a professional clarity that felt almost rude in its efficiency. Witnesses were called, friends who had seen Ashley in a different light, ex-colleagues who remembered a woman prone to reinvention, Kevin who testified to the slow erosion of certainty. We were all part of a terrible communal recounting that had to be surer than memory. Trial dates were set, dates that hung in the calendar like somber holidays. Sitting through depositions and hearings is an endurance test. I remembered my classroom and the patience it took to listen to children who spoke in circles. Now I had to listen to legal arguments made in a language designed to reduce nuance into evidence. Kevin testified in a voice I barely recognized. He read from emails and from saved texts. He spoke about the person he had loved and how love can be the mask someone hides behind. It was wrenching to hear him parse memory into fact in front of strangers, but it was necessary. The trial itself unfolded in a rhythm that blurred the public spectacle with procedural restraint. The prosecutor laid out the case, a pattern of behavior linking 2 prior deaths, financial motive, the presence of the toxin in Linda's bloodstream and in the wine, the spreadsheet documenting opportunities. The defense pushed back, alternate explanations, claims of misunderstandings, questions about the chain of custody. But juries respond to pattern and proportion, and the weight of the documents, the testimony, and Ashley's own admissions, both recorded and made in the light of police interviews, drove the narrative toward a certain inevitability. I did not watch every minute of the trial on television. Some of it was too close for comfort. Some of it felt like a liturgy of pain. I went when I needed to, sometimes sitting in the back row, the wood of the pew-like benches pressing into my knees in a way that made me feel steady. Kevin read from the laptop printouts in a voice that never wavered in the telling of date and time, but that trembled when he spoke of love. Linda testified with a reserve and strength that left me in awe. She said, simply, that she trusted what she'd been given. She did not cry on the stand. She did not need to dram. Her composure held the room in a way that was more telling than any show of grief. The verdict came after deliberation. The jurors returned with faces that had seen too much. Guilty on the charges that mattered, the judge said. The sentence, life. It was a sentence that carried the weight of a society's decision that the crime had been so severe, so calculated, that it could not be mitigated by time. When the gavel fell, a portion of the room exhaled collectively, a strange human exhalation of relief and sorrow tangled together. After the sentence, life moved in starts and quiet steps. Kevin left the marriage behind in the way a man might remove a heavy overcoat he wasn't ready to part with emotionally. He came to my house more often. We cooked. We sat on the porch and watched the wisteria bloom. Linda visited and made the biscuits she'd always made, and sometimes she'd sit and hold my hand and say, in that wry way she had, "We'll have berries yet." It was small and terribly important, a promise of seasons beyond harm. The neighborhood reverted to a softer hum after the press stopped circling. People returned with casseroles and polite smiles. Detective Murphy came by sometimes, more as a friend than a cop, and we would sit and talk about practical things like locks and mail holds, but mostly about softer survivals, how to sleep again, how to trust the small kindness of morning light. Danny stopped by for coffee. His badge was still clipped to him, but his eyes had changed. He'd seen the worst and stayed. We spoke sometimes of how the world divides into people who act and people who are acted upon, and how living requires a sort of small, stubborn action each day. There are things that changed forever. My sense of the world, my easy trust of neighbors, and moments of unguarded joy was altered. I limped through the first birthdays after the trial, making small cakes and resisting the urge to wrap everything in tissue. I found myself watching packages that arrived at the door in a way I hadn't before. I checked lids twice. Some of it was common sense, and some of it was the residue of fear. I learned to live with both. People asked me, sometimes kindly, sometimes bluntly, how I forgave. I gave them an answer that was small and true. I don't know that forgiveness is required of me. Forgiveness is for me if it frees me. Instead, I cultivated understanding that some people make choices we cannot follow, that cruelty can be clever and frighteningly ordinary. My life had been made smaller and larger at once. Larger in the sense that the community that rallied around me made me see how many small acts can repair. Smaller in the sense that I had been forced to hold only what was essential. I kept the recorder clip of Ashley's confession in a file the prosecutor had used in court. It felt wrong to listen, but I did, in the way one examines a scar to know if it's still healing. Her voice there was brittle and sometimes incoherent, but it had the ring of truth in places. Listening to it was not an act of revenge. It was a way to make sure that the narrative, the reality, remained fixed. On certain evenings, when the sky washed itself in pink and lavender and I brewed tea, I would think back to the day the bottles came on my stoop. It had been a small domestic moment that had made everything turn. I had given the bottle to Linda as an act of neighborly warmth. That choice had been the hinge. It had also been the thing that saved us. If I had left it in the house, who knows how that story might have shifted. It is a strange paradox, how a simple act can be both a risk and a salvation. Kevin did not remarry. He took time, years even, to find himself again outside of the marriage that had nearly broken him. He returned to his work with a warier step, but also with a new clarity about the kind of life he wanted to build. Linda grew her garden more deliberately. We sat together on holidays and acknowledged the absence she and I both felt, the absence of the easy assumptions that had once framed our lives. The county enacted a few small reforms, educational material about elder safety, a suggestion to the local paper to check how they would cover such stories in the future with a little more care and a little less appetite for spectacle. Detective Murphy did not seek public praise. She came by with a thermos and a steady, wry comment about the weather. We sometimes laughed, a brittle sound that softened with time. I returned to teaching in a small way. I began volunteering at the local adult education center, helping older residents with basic computer skills. The irony was not lost on me. A woman whose life had been upended by a spreadsheet now sat and taught others how to navigate one. But it felt good to give something back to the community that had held me. It felt like a reassertion of the life I'd lived before, one of building, not tallying. People ask me now, sometimes with a shocking curiosity, whether I felt fear for my life, whether I had regrets about taking that bottle to Linda's porch. The answers are complicated and human. Yes, I felt fear. The nights were edged with it for a long time. Regrets? Maybe, in a way, because life had been fractured, but if not for that small act, the story might have ended differently. The thought steadies and disrupts at the same time. The last I heard, Ashley remained incarcerated with the rest of the sentence that had been brought upon her. Life sentences are long arithmetic. They are measured in holidays missed and birthdays uncelebrated. They are measured in the slow passage of years. People asked if I hated her. I cannot say I hated someone who, in many ways, was a tragic product of choices and perhaps of certain appetites for self-preservation that hardened into cruelty. Instead, I felt a steadier thing, a quiet commitment to vigilance and to the fragile dignity of life. If there is a moral here, if you want a lesson to pin on the wall like a schoolroom poster, it is this: trust your instincts. Do not let politeness override the small alarms your body gives you. Small misalignments matter. If someone's question makes your skin prickle, take note, tell someone, keep records, and in the end, do not mistake that vigilance for paranoia. The difference is that paranoia is untethered. Vigilance is tethered to reason and the community you build around yourself. When people visit now, I sit them down with a cup of tea and a story that starts with a wine bottle and winds through a hospital and a pond and a courtroom. I tell it plainly because I want people to know the long arc of consequence that begins with small decisions. The garden has come back to life, the wisteria blooms like it always has, and in spring the streets smell like cut grass and possibility. The ordinary things of the day, mail, a neighbor's wave, the kettle, remain my small reliquaries. I do not live in fear. I live with an alertness sharpened by experience and tempered by the knowledge that most people are kind. I watch the door when packages arrive now, but I also answer it with a warmth that remembers how many times human hands have brought me casseroles and flowers and cups of sugar when I asked for them. If this story has made you think twice about a small thing or reminded you of the value of a hunch, leave a note in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Share your own moment where an instinct proved right. Sometimes those stories are the ones that help the most. If you want more of these true crime tales told from a human angle, please subscribe. Thank you for listening and for keeping attention as a kind of mercy.